Reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 1 to 6. The words of John the Apostle. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people. And God Himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And He that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And He said unto me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And He said unto me, It is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. That shining city in the midst of the stars, what the Bible says about heaven. And this is such an important subject that we're going to take 2 sessions overviewing what the Scripture says concerning our final home. Now, I don't know of any other subject in the Bible that has been the object of more misunderstanding, more ridicule, more misinterpretation than has the subject of heaven, unless possibly it is a subject of hell. There are those who say, well, yes, you're going to talk about that pie in the sky when you die nonsense. And some people would believe that, have us believe that heaven is a place where some disembodied spirits will sit on clouds eating, I guess, angel food cake with harps and halos throughout all eternity. Well, that may be what Walt Disney or comic books say about heaven, but the Bible has a totally different viewpoint. But there are a number of false views about heaven, as we have said. In fact, there are some who believe, and sometimes liberals advocate this, that really heaven and hell is experienced here on planet Earth. I remember a number of years ago hearing a liberal at Easter time. It was broadcast Sunday afternoon, and I think his church was located in Columbus, Ohio. And he said, you know, I no longer, as an enlightened clergyman, well, right away red flags went up. He said, I no longer believe in a sky-high heaven or a red-hot hell. He said, I think it unwise to speculate concerning the temperature of hell or the furniture of heaven. He said, in fact, to me, he said, in my mind, he said, all the heaven, all the hell we experience here on planet Earth. And he gave this illustration. He said, here is a man, let's call him Bob, and he has worked for his company for, perhaps nearly 40 years. And he's about ready to retire. It's the only real job he's had, but he doesn't quite have his financial picture ready. He's going to spend a few more years, but he's very happily contented there. And the boss, the regional boss walks into his office one morning, Monday morning, says, Bob, I've got some news. It's bad news, and I don't know how to tell you any other way, so I'll just tell you. He said, you know that we have an austerity program here. We have a cash flow program. Business is down. And you've been so faithful and loyal and dedicated over the years, but very frankly, we're going to have to terminate your position. Well, poor old Bob, his world has almost come to an end. He's worked there almost 40 years. He's too old to get a job anywhere else. What's he going to do? And not only that, but how's he going to explain this to his wife? Well, he goes home that night, and his wife is not there. And there's a note on the kitchen table. And in essence, it says, look, there's no one else involved, but I guess as the young people would say, frankly, after a number of years in marriage, I want out. I want my space, so I'm leaving you. I'd like to remain single the rest of my life. Well, his whole world is caving in. He's lost his job and now his wife, and what else can go wrong? The telephone rings. And the doctor says, now, we need to take more tests, but I need to tell you, though, it looks very, very serious. In fact, your problem may be fatal. Well, now, his entire world has collapsed around him. He's lost his job, his wife, and now perhaps his very life. And the clergyman said, now, brother, if that would happen, that's hell. But he said, let us suppose that the poor guy gets through the week somehow, and Friday afternoon he's in his office cleaning out the desk and his files and everything, and the branch manager walks in, but this time he has the big guy himself from Chicago, the owner of the company. And the branch manager introduces the owner to Bob, and the owner says, you know, Bob, I've heard a lot about you. We've never met, but I appreciate so much the work you've done. Now, it is true. We have a problem here financially, but the branch manager and I have talked, and the long and short is we may have to lay off others, but we decided we have to keep you. And we're sorry we'll put you through it this week, but we're going to make some arrangements. If you'll agree to stay, that we'll not only guarantee you a job as long as you want it, but we'll raise your salary. Well, he's feeling a little better, but he's still got some problems. And he goes home, and his wife is there. And she throws her arms around him and says, you know, she said, we still got a few problems in our marriage, but she said, this 1 week away from you, I determined I'd rather stay with you. I'd rather be with you than without, and so we're in it for the long haul. Well, he's feeling much better, but there's still that health problem, and the phone rings. The doctor says, great news. You have a problem, but the tests have demonstrated and shown that we can handle it with medication. You're home free. Well, the clergyman said, when that happens, he said, brother, he said, that's heaven. So he concluded the only heaven, the only hell a person receives, they receive here on planet Earth. Do you know something? Without that infidel and in-for-hell clergyman being remotely aware of what he was saying, in a way, I agree 100%. In one sense of the word, this world is the only heaven, and it is the only hell that people will experience. Let me give you illustration of this, explanation. A number of years ago, I was on a plane from L.A. flying into St. Louis, Missouri. And I'd read everything on the plane, and I was trying to go to sleep, and I couldn't. And I found a copy of Business Review magazine. And normally I wouldn't even get within 10 feet of a magazine like that. It'd be so boring. But I thought, it is boring. It'll be as dry as dust, and it'll put me to sleep. And, well, I picked it up, and it wasn't boring at all. In fact, I read an article that made me very upset, and I stayed awake to read it. This was in I forget when it was, but anyway, it's January, and it was the Business Review overview of the businesses in America the year before that. And one of the articles had to do with a certain porno industry. And according to this article, this Business Review article, that porno empire had grossed over $400 million the previous year. And the owner of that company had netted over $50 million. And you know, I became rather upset with God as I read that. Did you ever get so upset with God, sort of tell him off? And I said, dear Lord, this is terrible. Here's a guy that hates you. His company's grossed $400 million. He's netted $50 million. Now, Lord, I'm sure you're not only a great theologian, but you're a good mathematician. Lord, that's almost $1 million a week. Dear God, think of how many churches that could build. Think of how many missionaries that support. Think of how many Bibles that could publish. Lord, it isn't fair. The more I thought about it, though, I concluded maybe it's not quite as unfair as I thought. Now, this fellow, I'm sure, would never ask me, this porno king, what I thought about anything. But let us suppose, as I understand he's up there in the years now, and he might say, hey, Wilmington, I've got a few years left, and I'm asking different people from different walks of life, different philosophies, what their game plan is and what their advice, how I might carry on the affairs of the last few years of my life. Well, he never asked me that, of course, but if he did, I would say, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you just keep on doing exactly what you're doing? You know, I mean, man, if it feels good, do it. You know, that's the right way. Well, I'm sure that he would never ask me, but I would conclude by saying, I'd try to use a shock treatment, but let me just say one thing. You know, you do what you, I mean, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. But let me tell you, buddy, let me tell you, get all your kicks down here, because you know this world is the only heaven that you'll ever know. Stop and think about that. This world is the only heaven that the unsaved person will ever know. And if you're listening to the program here and you have no desire whatsoever to accept Jesus Christ, I would say then eat, drink, and be merry, and get all your kicks down here. It doesn't get any better than this, and it really doesn't. Because this world is the only heaven that you'll ever know. Now, of course, some of you may realize where I'm going now. The other side of the coin, this world is the only hell that the child of God will ever experience. A lady said sometime ago to me, she said, I just don't understand why God allows certain things to come into my life. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, sometimes I feel like I'm a little bird and I'm a cage, and I'm surrounded by circumstances and I can't get out. And the devil comes by and he has a stick, and like a dirty bully, he's reaching in there and he's punching me, and I cry and I bleed, why does God allow that? I said, why not? I said, God is on occasion going to allow the world, the flesh, and the devil to beat up on us a little down here, not to punish us often, but usually to purify us. And He'll allow that to happen because He knows that those three enemies of mankind, world, flesh, and the devil, cannot touch us up there. In other words, what we're saying, this world is the only heaven the unsaved person will ever know, but it's the only hell the child of God will ever experience. Now, actually, let's look at the categories in heaven. We're talking about heaven. There are 4 heavens mentioned in the Bible. In fact, the first verse in the Bible tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. 4 heavens. There is the first heaven. Daniel and Jesus mentioned that heaven when they spoke about the fowls, the birds of the heavens. Well, of course, that's the atmospheric heavens, the home of the clouds and the birds, and that's a beautiful heaven, but that's not the heaven I'm going to talk about in the next few moments. Then there's a second heaven. In Psalm 19, verse 1, David said on one occasion, he said, he looked up into the heavens, and he was watching his father's sheep in the Judean hills. He saw the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper and the North Star, and he exclaimed, the heavens declare the glory of God. Well, David was talking about the second heaven. And that's the home of the moon and the stars and the sun, the home of outer space. And what a magnificent, breathtaking heaven that is. But that's not the heaven that we want to talk about today. Now, there's a third heaven. The Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 2, he said, on one occasion, folks, he said, I was caught up beyond the first heaven, beyond the second heaven, into the third heaven, and there I saw things, I heard things, I experienced things so glorious I couldn't even write about. Well, that's the third heaven. That's the present day home of God and the abode of the angels. And that's a wonderful heaven. And if we depart and be with the Lord right now, that's the heaven we'll go to. But that's really not the ultimate heaven. And it's not the heaven that I want to talk about now. And there is a fourth heaven. And that is found in Revelation 21, verse 1, where John said, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of God, out of heaven, as a bride adorned for her husband. That's the fourth husband. That's the fourth, as a bride adorned for her husband. That's the fourth heaven. And that's the heaven that I want to talk about, because that is the permanent and future home of all believers. Now, from this point on, if you can think of heaven in terms of a literal city with literal streets, literal people, a literal park, literal trees, a literal river, and a literal throne, then you have a scriptural concept of the doctrine of heaven. The capital of heaven, it is a literal city. Now, this city was anticipated in the Old Testament. Abraham lived and died 2,000 years before Jesus came upon the scene. But in Hebrews 11, verse 10, years later, a fitting epitaph was written concerning the life of Abraham. And this is what Hebrews 11, verse 10 said. It says, for he, Abraham, looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So 20 centuries before Christ came upon the scene, Abraham was looking for a city. Well, 1,000 years went by. And that shepherd boy, David, is now king over all of Israel. And one day he was in the city of David, Jerusalem, and he was in the Oval Office looking over the city, and apparently he began to think about that same city that Abraham had anticipated 1,000 years before that. And in Psalm 46, verse 4, he said, there is a river, the streams whereof make glad the city of God. He's not talking about Jerusalem. There's never been a river associated with Jerusalem. He's talking about the heavenly city. And in Psalm 87, verse 3, he says, glorious things are spoken of Zion, city of our God. So this city was anticipated in the Old Testament. Then you come to the gospel account in John chapter 14. Jesus promises to build that city. In the gospel accounts, right before His crucifixion, Jesus stood in the upper room and He said, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are literally many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." In other words, we said thus far, this city is anticipated in the Old Testament, it is promised in the Gospels, and it is referred to in the epistles. For example, the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 22, the author says, "But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and an innumerable company of angels." So it's anticipated in the Old Testament, promised in the Gospels, referred to in the epistles, but it is not until you come to the very last book in the Bible, the next to the last chapter in the Bible, Revelation chapter 1, chapter 21, the first 6 verses, that you find this city anticipated in the Old Testament, promised in the Gospels, referred to in the epistles, now described by an eyewitness account, and we read that passage at the beginning of this program, the heavenly city, New Jerusalem. Now, the next few minutes, and there are very few left probably, I'd like to talk about some of the characteristics of heaven, facts about this heavenly city, the shape of this city. According to Revelation 21, the first part, verse 16, the first part of the verse, the city lieth foursquare. So we have two possibilities. It has a foursquare base. Now, it can be in the form of a cube. It can be in the form of a pyramid, because both have a foursquare base. And you have those who argue that it's cubical. You have those who argue that it's going to be like a pyramid. I don't care if it's pretzel shaped. I mean, the question is, are we going to be there? But it has a foursquare base. And then in that same chapter, the last part of verse 16, we know something about the size of our heavenly city. And this is absolutely incredible, the size of the city. The Bible says it was measured, and John measured it and found out it was 12,000 furlongs wide, 12,000 furlongs long, and the height of it also 12,000 furlongs. Now, in modern measurement, folks, we're talking about a city 1,400 miles long, 1,400 miles wide, and this is the kicker here, 1,400 miles in its height. How big is the city? 1,400 times 1,400 times 1,400. Now, I'm from Illinois, and we have a saying there, you know, such and such, he took a shine to you, or he took a shine to me. That means he likes us. Now here, let's say that we are introduced to a trillionaire, and he owns the whole earth. Well, of course, it's Jesus, but let's just say this is a human trillionaire, and he takes a shine to you. He said, "You know, you're such a nice person, and I tell you what, I own the whole earth, and I understand you want to buy some land to build on or start a business. I'll allow you to buy as many square miles of land on planet Earth as you want for $1 per square mile." Wow! Well, if we're going to dream, let's hallucinate here. So you say, let's go for the gold. I'll take it all. Well, you're going to have to write that guy, as if he would need the money, a check for $60 million, because there are 60 million square miles attached to planet Earth. And by doing that, you'd own every single inch of Earth connected with our planet. Well, a few weeks later, you would meet this guy. Of course, by this time, he's jaywalking, isn't he? He's trespassing because you own all that. He said, "How do you like your new possession? Really like them? You know, you're such a nice person. Tell you what, how would you like the water rights? I'll give you the same deal, $1 per square mile of water surface." Well, this time, you would more than have to double the check. You would give him a check payable to him for $130 million. And by doing this, a $160 million check, $130 million check, you would theoretically, in this crazy story, own every single inch of water and land surface attached to our planet. Now, what does this crazy story have to do with the size of our heavenly home? Simply this. If you multiply 1,400 times 1,400, you get the square mile figure of our heavenly city, of our heavenly home. But if you multiply 1,400 times 1,400, and you have to do this, times 1,400, you get the cubic mile figure of our heavenly city, which is more than 14 times the size, the space of the entire world. In other words, what we're saying here, there's room at the cross for you. Though millions have come, there's still room for one. So don't worry about heaven being, Robert Ripley, the Believe It or Not, used to say that heaven was all filled up. He had it all figured out. It filled up about the time of the Protestant Reformation. But he never heard that song, There is room at the cross for you. Though millions have come, there's still room for one. Yes, there's room at the cross for you. Well, we know something about the shape and the size, the foundations. There are 12 foundations, gold, silver, etc., and diamond, incredible. And the name of one of the apostles on each of the 12 foundations. We know something about the wall of the city. The wall is about 153 feet high, and it's made of jasper. So when we sing about the jasper walls, that's what the Scripture talks about. The main street of the city is made of transparent gold. The buildings, according to Psalm 45, may be made of ivory. And then that beautiful song, out of the ivory palaces into a world of woe. The gates of the city are made of solid pearl. There are 12 gates. Now, J. Vernon McGee, a great Bible teacher, once said, he said, the coat of arms of our heavenly city seems to be not the jasper wall or the ivory towers or the golden streets, but the pearl. There are 3 gates on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the east, 3 on the west, and all 12 are made of solid pearl. Everywhere you look, there's a pearl. And he said, a pearl is different from all other earthly gems in that a pearl is formed by a living creature, an oyster. And often what happens, an oyster gets a grain of sand in its side, and it wraps that grain of sand with its own substance, layer upon layer, and coat upon coat, until often a beautiful pearl is found. And McGee says, I think the gates will be made of pearl to serve as a reminder to all believers that we were once a dirty little grain of sand in the sight and sight of God. We were unattractive, we're spiritually ugly, but God so loved the world that He wrapped us as sinners, layer upon layer and coat upon coat of His own substance. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. And so the gates are there made of solid pearl, I think, as a reminder throughout all eternity, so we can sing of the grace of God and sing, not have I gotten but what I received. Grace has bestowed it since I have believed. Boasting excluded, pride I abase. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Now, there is a throne mentioned in heaven. Daniel sees this throne in Daniel chapter 7. And John sees it in Revelation chapter 4. And both of them report they see a magnificent being seated on this throne. And John refers to him as the Ancient of Days. And this seems to be the Father Himself seated on this throne. Then there's a river, in Revelation chapter 22. And John sees a river, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne. Then there is a tree of life. John also sees this in Revelation 22. And it bears 12 kinds of fruit each month, and the fruit are for the health of the nations. We said in a previous broadcast when we were talking about hell, the worst thing about hell is directly tied in to the greatest thing about heaven. The worst thing about hell is a place where Jesus Christ will be conspicuously absent throughout all eternity. But the greatest thing, the greatest fact, and we're talking about facts in heaven now, concerning heaven, heaven is a place where Jesus Christ will be conspicuously present throughout all eternity. I've often wondered, will we be able, unless we're introduced to these people in heaven, will we be able to recognize Paul or Peter or David or Moses or Elijah? Maybe we'll get them mixed up. Well, I thought that was David. No, that's Elijah. Probably have to have a scorecard to keep the players correct. But there's one person we won't have to be introduced to. And there's a song, and we'll close our session with this song that speaks about that. It says, when my life's work is ended, and I cross the swelling tide, and the glory of the resurrection see, I shall know my Redeemer, may not know Peter or Paul, when I cross the other side, and His smile will be the first to welcome me. Well, I shall know Him, as redeemed by His side I shall stand. How am I going to know Him? Oh, I shall know Him by the print of the nails in His hand.